Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to quarterfinals of THR Debate Open. Woo! In opening government, we have NUS. All you have to do is stay. Woo! Opening up, we have DJ Gaston and his Nobel Prize. CG, we have NUS Mean, and COPACA. My name is Dave. I'll be your chair. Handling with me are Leroy and Huzaimi. On that note, I invite the Prime Minister to start the debate. Yeah.
It's not an open secret that women are underrepresented in technology, and it's often due to how they are treated by their male colleagues. However, we feel the policy of the opposition bench does nothing to solve that problem at the point in time in which they don't address these opinions of a significant group of people in the tech industry in the open, and therefore they let the problem fester even more. 4 points of substantive argumentation. First is that not all of what James Damore says is bullshit, and it, in fact, does not meet the threshold for like overtly discriminatory, arguments against like the role of women in technology. So let's just characterize that for a moment, right? What did James Damore actually say? He quotes specific studies that purport to show that, for example, men and women are intelligent or have talents in different ways. Some of which may not include, scientific or mathematical talents in the case of women. So not that all female engineers or female programmers suck. Is that on average you will see fewer of these people represented in the top tiers of the technology sector than males do. Secondly, he also says that men and women function best in different ways. So he says that, for example, maybe females work better when their emotional needs are better taken care of, when they're in a more communitarian environment, or when they are posted to different roles within Google, for example, right? So I'm not going to say that these things are right or wrong, but they're not necessarily outright discriminatory. That's one. They are based on some scientific evidence, which is debatable, obviously, but then we must have that debate, right? No, thank you. And more importantly, it is not directly targeting individual members or individual females in Google. He is not casting aspersions on the character or the talent of individual female engineers. Rather, he's describing a statistical average that is not even unique to his particular company. So even if it's true that his analysis is false, it does not meet the standard for what constitutes discriminatory behavior on language in the company. At that point in time, we don't think it is principally fair to fire him, given the fact that he ought to have a right to freedom of speech and expression, not merely in theory as guaranteed by the US Constitution, but in practice, because if you're fired from a source of living for saying things, then you might as well not have that right in the first place. So that's one. More importantly, though, there is some practical impact to this as well, because at the point in time in which the most important part of his document was not about the statistical research, but about what his male colleagues thought of female engineers, and therefore seemingly legitimate concerns that had to be addressed regarding their opinions of female engineers. But more importantly, the recommendations that he proposed, which were for the most part actually fairly reasonable, right? Regarding, okay, maybe we need to provide more emotional support and more mentorship opportunities for women in tech. The recommendations were reasonable, even if the justifications were not necessarily so. And at the point in time in which you tarnish James Damore's image by firing him, you are labeling all of his recommendations as unfair in the eyes of the general public and in the eyes of female engineers, even though there were some parts of the document that made sense and some parts that don't. Because we're not all rational, males or females, and when we see that the person who's proposing these views was discredited, then the views themselves will end up being discredited, even if they ought not to be uniformly so. Yeah.
Could you just be a little more specific? What were the things that you think he was recommending in his memo?
As I said, increased mentorship opportunities for female engineers, like more emotional engagement and addressing emotional needs of female engineers in such industries. Maybe not all of his recommendations were sound. You can tell me more about that in opening opposition. Second major area of substantive argumentation. It hides the central issue, right? Because the central issue that plagues women in technology is about how male engineers mistreat them, discriminate against them, don't give them important roles, or outright downplay their opinions or their analysis when they write programs and plan projects, right? And at the point in time in which Google ameliorates some of the social pressure to do something about the situation by appointing James Damore as a scapegoat, instead of actually doing anything serious about the situation, they deflect some of this social pressure. They get away with token measures. They don't actually do anything to help women in the long run. And this means that we see far less change than we otherwise would have if there was no scapegoat and if there was more social pressure against Google as a result, and therefore they actually had to take James Damore's concerns seriously and therefore enact more systemic measures to help women in tech. If it means including more female engineers in your teams, if it means putting more female heads in charge, if it means identifying more progressive male engineers and putting them in charge of mixed teams, these are all the things that could have been done but will not be done because Google has the ability to deflect social pressure by appointing a scapegoat. Third major area of substantive argumentation, that it makes the problem worse because A, there is going to be a reaction from, and not an open reaction obviously, from male engineers who are conservative or who genuinely feel that female engineers are inferior. It festers underground, well not literally underground, where male engineers who have to work with female engineers in the teams are going to take it out, not by airing their views in the open, right, but instead using alternative channels like bullying the female colleagues even more. Because we need to recognize, they can't just say, oh, but they're going to bully them anyway, right? Because bullying and discrimination exists on a spectrum, sometimes it's casual, sometimes it's vitriolic. At the point in time in which you fire James Damore, one of the more outspoken and one of the more constructive, if mistaken, people from among this group of engineers who want to do something to improve the company, then the rest of them are going to be even more vitriolic in their treatment of female engineers. And at the point in time in which you're not going to change the gender proportion of engineers in Google, one of the biggest companies, one of the most progressive companies in Silicon Valley, anytime soon relative to Palantir or any of the other Silicon Valley companies, you're not going to make the problem better. You're going to make the problem worse. You might see, instead of 80% males at Google, 90% or 95% within the next 10 years, thanks to the fact that you've made the discrimination against women on the ground within the ranks of the company even worse. Furthermore, we say that you're firing people who are at least constructive and sincere about it, right? You are basically choosing the wrong people. You are keeping the lemons, the people who are closet racist and closet sexist in this case, in the company, rather than the people who are prepared to speak out in the open, have their opinions challenged, and try to be constructive about the process, but at least including half sensible recommendations. You're basically targeting the wrong sort of people to fire, even if you agree that someone should have been fired in the first place. Last but not least, we think that it is important to have a marketplace of ideas, a free marketplace of ideas in general, but especially when we're talking about scientific concepts. Maybe most, if not all, of the scientific journal articles that Damore cited in attempting to justify differences in the types of intelligence and personality traits between men and women were bullshit. Even if that were the case, it is very hard for the average engineer or for the average member of the general public to decide which scientific articles a la Wakefield and autism and vaccines are false and which ones are actually legit. And at the point in time in which you refuse to have a proper discussion over what constitutes good scientific data, when you just shut down and fire people who raise these opinions in public, you piss off a lot of people who are no longer prepared to listen to you constructively because it is seen as an attack on their identity as males, when females might be able to say the same thing and get away with it, even if those opinions are controversial. For all of those reasons, I urge you to go with opening government.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. We invite Leader of Opposition to start up the case for OO.
I think it's important to note that the PM's speech, most of his benefits were not mutually exclusive, such as recommendations of having mentorships and affirmative action policies. Those can exist with any individual telling Google to do so. It doesn't need to be a discriminatory individual who uses justification of bigoted views that are supported by bigoted studies and doesn't recognize the studies that has debunked those studies in the first place. We think we have better actors that can propagate those kinds of views and propagate it better because they're principally consistent with what Google wants and principally consistent with what women need at the end of the day. Not demonizing the identity as an individual by telling them that they're not capable and they're not put on the same pedestal as men. I think that's a lot worse. The other thing he told us is freedom of speech. number one, we ban freedom of speech, the point in which you harm another individual's identity when you demonize them, i.e. we ban hate speeches. But also, and this is most important, in workplaces, we set standards to when your freedom of speech can be acceptable. Meaning, you can't preach your religion. You can't say that Jews are supposed to be in hell. You can't say those hurtful things because companies set their standards and metrics to do so. Just like how companies can set standards to force you to wear uniforms. Just because you have freedom of speech doesn't mean you can come in flip-flops and shorts. We think it's right for the companies to also protect their own individuals in those workplaces, i.e. women in this circumstance. Realizing that your memo, that isn't even, like the main purpose of your memo isn't even to curb discrimination or to give recommendations, but it's literally just a fuck you to the face of every single woman. When your memo was not even part of a discussion, but instead telling every other woman on the ground that you're not as capable as men, that you're not technically as talented. I think that's a lot worse and really demonizing and demotivating a lot of women, especially women in Google and every other tech industry at the end of the day. We would rather not take that trade-off. The other thing he told us is that he highlights the recommendation, right? 3 responses. Number 1, but the overall argument that he actually gave was that women are not capable. So yes, he did give recommendations, but that's not how people will perceive his memo to be. People will only take the most controversial thing, that women aren't as capable, that women aren't as talented as men. Those are the kinds of narrative that you'll send out in status quo. The second level of analysis is that the recommendation can be given to anyone, but it's important to recognize this because you have to be principally consistent to what the company wants. This directly leads to my first argument on why it's important that Google has to do this. Realize the characterization that Google's a really big company. It's a symbolic company that fights for good values. There's a search engine that gives so many good benefits to people on the ground, from social change, from engaging with one another, especially when they are the metaphor for success in Silicon Valley, when they're a metaphor how you can succeed as a tech company in the tech industry. If they are silent, assuming in status quo there's a different time frame, right? So if they're silent and didn't fire him, that also sends a message that legitimizes his views and opinions. But realize the context here is that they regret his firing. So it's already happened, and now they're saying, oh, we're sorry, we shouldn't have fired him in the first place. That points Google as a contradictory business model. It points Google that every single diversity that they have, from hiring racial diversities, from hiring sexual diversity, they're probably one of the first Silicon Valley companies to even hire more women at the end of the day. All of this progress, we backtrack the point in which Google is seen as a contradictory model or contradictory company. We think your global standard in diversity will not exist anymore when Google tells other individuals that, you know what, women just isn't as good as men. Before I move on, are there any POIs?
Yeah. So we can call him out without having to fire him. Can you please tell us why firing him is going to change the opinions of all the male engineers in Google that haven't worked with female engineers in the first place, followed by substantive argumentation?
Okay, so yeah, by firing him, you send a really strong message in the narrative, especially as a company with a CEO that tells every other man and woman that women are as equal as men. They use unfair for you to demonize their identity. It's unfair for you to put them in a lower pedestal. Those narratives are the ones that will directly engage with those individuals. But yes, we recognize that men also need to engage in the narratives that women will face, that how you need to engage with the feminist movement. Yeah, you can do it outside the workplace. It doesn't need to be in Google. That's why you have protests outside. That's why you have public forums outside of your company. It doesn't have to be in your workplaces. This is like how we don't allow preaching of religion in workplaces. We think that's the principle that you needed to engage upon. But what happens the point in which you let this individual stay? This is important. Number 1, you create a toxic environment for other individuals. So managers are less likely to put women to work with this James fella because they're scared that you create some form of uncomfortability between women. You also reduce the conducive environment for women because they feel targeted and they feel attacked. The point in which you have to work with an individual, especially when the individual uses Google's name in his memo by saying that I'm a Google engineer and this is my views that I wish to propagate at the end of the day. If Google doesn't say anything about it, that's literally sending a message that Google is okay with it, that Google also principally aligns with what James is saying. Those are the kinds of circumstances where you harm women in Google itself. This means that number 1, you have lesser women joining Google at the end of the day. Means you'll have less policies that cater to women, less affirmative action policies, less policies that want to tackle the wage gap, less policies that give maternity leaves, because the women in the workplaces are continuously going to be a minority, especially when Google doesn't have any benefits or any structural reasons to protect women. When you allow these kinds of policies, when they allow these kinds of views to be propagated in the workplace especially, is the point in which you have less women feeling safe to work in Google or any other tech company. what's the real world impact towards this? Means you have less women going to universities to take computer science programs or to take IT programs. Why? Because the way in which they want to get a job is not protected at the end of the day. The job environment is male dominant with male dominant narratives that doesn't recognize women as individuals who can compete with men at the end of the day. This is important. So it's harder for individuals to express their identity. It's harder for individuals to achieve any form of happipiness because no one allows them to do so. When every time they go to work, they will feel demonized and discriminated upon. I think that's unfortunate, but sure, it's unfortunate this individual has to lose their job, but for the benefit of every other individual and the benefit for younger women and younger generations to come, we will take that trade-off. You will fire that one individual if it means women feel protected and women are able to express themselves at the end of the day. If you didn't do so, you legitimize his views. You legitimize every other male individual who also supports his views, and you continue that vicious cycle of propagation that women are not technically as talented as men. When the word spreads outside of Google to other tech industries in Silicon Valley, this is also when less women will feel included in Silicon Valley. This is also when you have less women participating in your discourse or any form of discussions, especially when it comes to tech industries and IT industries. You'll have less people propagating for mentorships because no one wants to engage with those individuals, especially when a big company like Google legitimizes those views and doesn't say anything about it. We beg to oppose.
Thank you very much, Leader of Opposition. Invite Deputy Prime Minister.
There is a big difference between not firing someone and legitimizing what that person has said.
Okay.
And in this debate, we are going to explain to you why we thought that the firing process was the specifically wrong action to take with regards to the way in which it distorted the media attention surrounding the issue and only allowed for structural problems to fester. Large part of what Adil already told you. But firstly, we told you on our side that you can call him out without firing him. Here's the crucial difference between these two actions. When you fire someone, when you call someone out, you're simply restating your company's position with regards to diversity hiring and the importance that it places on the fact that more women ought to join that specific industry. But at the same time, you also show that you respect the fact that individuals within your company can hold views that are different, that can hold views that they think are substantiated and are willing to have an open and fair discussion about these viewpoints with them. The difference is when you fire the individual, it shows two things. Firstly, it shows that you're willing to use the exertion of power in order to punitively punish someone for something that they have done which they felt was completely within their rights. That's problematic because it feeds into the idea that these are companies, they are oftentimes places that are not safe for conservatives and that they are willing to use that power to shut down alternative voices in that discussion. Adil already gave you lots of analysis why the fact that this means that discussion simply go underground is going to be worse. And I'm going to further elaborate on that when I tell you why it means structural problems will fester. But the second thing that we need to talk about is that given that Google is a company that prioritizes itself in free thinking and diversity of thought, this particular action shows that you're not willing to actually respect the concept of free speech. Understanding the concept of free speech and free expression is a darling of what the conservatives believe in. So you recognize that conservatives need to be engaged with, rejecting something that they hold dear, that they already criticize the liberal media for doing, which is shutting down conservative opinions without actually dealing with the nuances of what that opinion is saying, simply reinforces the idea that these are companies that cannot be reasoned with. Why is this therefore a problem? Firstly, I think that it is untrue on their side to simply just assert that women are going to be completely equal to men and will be able to get equal place in the tech field anyway. Whether or not this is genetic or socialized is still up for debate, in fact, among even the greatest family scholars in the world. Recognizing that, we need to realize that sometimes things that people talk about when it comes to the unfairness and discrimination in the tech industry may be very uncomfortable to what liberal people really believe. The idea that perhaps women are not as suited to the tech industry because they've been socialized into doing other things in life rather than doing tech. These are all real problems, but unfortunately, shutting down these opinions doesn't allow for these uncomfortable truths to be something that is heard by the rest of society, because you are saying that these are unpopular opinions. The problem becomes when people actually do believe in these things, recognizing especially that people like James Damore, for example, are highly qualified individuals that genuinely believe in the positions that they are in. And Google and the tech industry are made up of these kinds of people. So silencing them doesn't take away the fact that they continue to believe in these opinions, but rather simply says that they ought not be voicing those opinions out. Why is that hugely problematic? Firstly, recognizing that there is a real problem in that society, i.e. even with diversity hiring quotas, 80% of Google is still made out of male engineers, shows you that there are structural problems and systemic disadvantages that women face when it comes to entering these companies. It could potentially be things like company culture, for example. That means that men, for example, microaggress women and continually put them down when it comes to when it comes to the way in which they want to express themselves. It could also mean that the way the company is structured doesn't give enough credence to what women do and makes life very difficult for them in these circumstances. The problem is that a lot of these problems happen on an individual and happens on a personal level between the male engineers and the female engineers. It's oftentimes the way that these people make subtle decisions, for example, like who they want to promote, who they want to work with, and what they say to these women, that causes the kind of immense misogynistic view that women have that causes them to eventually leave that company. The reason why this is important is because we need to recognize that an administrative decision that comes from the top down doesn't change the minds of the people who continue to treat women in this particular method. And creating a scenario in which they are going to be seen on the pain of being fired if they ever express these opinions does not allow for those opinions to be engaged with at any point of time. That was the bulk of ideal substantive that they didn't want to deal with. But more importantly, in just a second, Hazim, I would argue that the way that the mainstream media often capitalizes on these forms of firing processes makes James Damore a martyr and distorts the ability of discourse to be able to actually reach the core of the issue. Yes.
It's not enough to tell me that people can't say what they want if what they want is massively harmful to women who already are there and women who would like to join in the future. What do you do to protect those women?
So firstly, I think that's a massive wrong characterization of the memo, right? So the memo literally said that we don't deny that sexism exists in the tech industry, but here are some reasons that might show why the massive imbalances are not entirely just due to sexism. I think that even if I don't personally agree with it, I think there's a moderated stance that is entirely legitimate for a person to express. And the fact that you're saying that it's harmful to women simply is exactly what the media is telling you, and that's what we're talking about now. The media has massively mischaracterized the memo to talk about how the memo is something that simply says that women are not fit to work in the tech industry. The reason why this is problematic is because it only fits into the polarization of the way that the liberal media and conservative opinions interact with one another. Recognize that changes as a whole require free and open discussion. These Google engineers, as seen by James Damore, for example, are open to discussion. That's the reason why he wrote the memo in the first place, to represent the views of himself and his colleagues and to send it out to canvass opinions to the rest of Google in order to see whether or not they agree with these specific memos and these recommendations. At a point at which you shut down even people who want to create this open and fair discussion, you are simply saying that the opinions that you have, if they don't gel with what the company's official stance is, despite the fact that the reality is very different, then you ought not speak up at all. That's incredibly problematic because we recognize that what happens now is that you create a division between the liberal media and these conservative opinions. The lack of engagement means that the way that the media continues to portray these issues, given that he's been fired, is to simply talk about James Damore as an individual and not talk about the contents of the memo as a whole. So what happens now is that you villainize this individual and say he deserves to be fired because he has these opinions. You're not saying that you're not talking about whether the opinions themselves are right or wrong in terms of his merit. You're simply saying we don't agree with this and therefore you ought to be fired. That's immensely problematic in a world in which conservatives already view the liberal media as not being willing to talk to them and discuss with them. I would argue that the Google engineers are very intelligent people. They are willing to be reasoned with, as the memo shows. But the point at which you fire this individual means that he's now able to use that particular platform to talk about how Google has shut down his opinions and shut down all of these conservative ideas. This doesn't mean that people don't want to continue working at Google. It just means that they will hide these opinions that they have and continue to perpetuate the same systemic problems and the same kinds of microaggressions that make the tech industry so uncomfortable for women to work with. Look, I recognize that the memo may not sit well with everyone, but sometimes things need to be said in order for the discussion to progress, such that we can actually get to the root of the problem and potentially even change some minds. We're happy to propose. And this was my best attempt at
Yeah. Thank you very much. Here, invite Yellow to end the exchange on the open tab.
Sherman's speech was a great example of why the fetishization of nuance in debate that's going on really needs to end, because it leads to a blurring of lines of what is acceptable and what isn't. So I'm going to tackle in my speech a couple of things. One, what did James actually say in his thing? And I'll take them at their best with the nuance that he supposedly has and why that's still very problematic and he still deserves to be fired. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about how engagement on our side still can happen, but like you said, oh, you shouldn't have fired him, should have called him out, right? The way it happens matters. Likewise, the way he handled it matters, and that's why engagement can happen in other ways that are not contradictory. Thirdly, which is the same point, right? Why he had to actually be fired, right? And why that at least how it relates to the arguments that my first speaker said that really just didn't go engage with at all, right? It was just a lot of arguments about like, oh, free speech, he deserves to be protected, fine, but debates are comparative, right? You didn't say anything about why women need to be protected, right? Telling me that, oh, but he didn't understand what was in his speech doesn't deal with how women perceive that speech and therefore the protections that they need and how comfortable they feel working in Google, right? You have to engage with those things. The last thing she didn't also engage with was the idea of the principle of businesses and their right to be able to a certain extent, determine the kind of speech that happens in their places of business. So all that will be discussed in the speech. First off, what did he actually say? The nuance that they're talking about, right? He said, oh, it's debatable, right? It's sort of the same thing. Yes, he started out his memo by saying, I support diversity, I support women's rights, right? But that's just like saying, no offense, but proceeds to see something really, really offensive and racist, right? So just because you say no offense at the beginning of it, doesn't mean the end conclusion of it is any better, right? That's one. Two, we tell you that the sources that he used to cite, and this is what's really damaging, right? Were actually really shoddy scientific journals that are not backed up and are not peer approved, right? Yeah, the problem with that, no thank you. The problem with that is that the CEO of Google actually wrote a counter memo defending, right? Like attacking that and actually brought other scientific studies that are actually backed up, right? So even Sherman and Adil are not willing to say that they just want to say to the extent that it's debatable, right? We personally don't believe in it, but it's debatable. Here's the things that were said that they think are debatable. That women are not mathematically inclined. That women are not able to be technically competent engineers. To the extent that they exist in Google, they are the exceptions rather than the rule. Women should stick to fields that are more towards their own proclivities and things that they are better at. Those are the conclusions that are reached. And within the scientific community, I would say there's a 90% consensus that those things are certainly not true, right? It's not as debatable as they would like to say. So coming up here and saying nuance does not mean you're right and does not mean those sorts of speeches should be entertained. That being said, engagement can happen outside of the confines of the business, right? So we told you how business entities can have the right to stifle free speech to the extent that it leads to a harmful workplace environment, right? Adil and cannot come into the workplace and say you have to be Muslim or you should leave Islam or you should be Christian, you should be Jewish, right? Free speech, guys, I should be able to say what I want, right? Because it makes for a polarized working environment that makes it uncomfortable for people around them who disagree with those views. Those conversations can happen in a bunch of other ways. For example, outside the workplace, for example, speaking one-on-one to your managers, right? Where you, in a way that you're trying to actually understand what's and have a dialogue versus attacking. And that's the key comparative here, right? In the memo, it was not a memo of let's open dialogue and talk about these things, guys. I know there's nuance on your side and my side. Let's talk about this. No, it was a memo of attack distributed to the entire company. I go completely against everything that you all stand for in this company. And that was attacking to every woman and every principle that Google stands for. The way in which he did it mattered. And that's part of the reason why he was fired. Other ways that you could also have it. An organized discussion as part of Google, right? So an HR seminar where people are open to say what they want, right? Where it's anonymous, where people are say I guarantee you will not be fired. You can say whatever you want. This is a safe space where people can do. So they come into that mindset willing to engage. That's where real engagement happened, guys. Not by firing off this memo that's meant to provoke and get reactions like the ones that we got. And yes, did end up getting him fired. Before I go on to reasons why he had to be fired and the consequences of that, sure.
Unlike things like spreading your religion in the company, the memo was designed to critique the diversity practices that Google had implemented, which was a response about something that the engineers felt individually affected them as well. Why was that not a legitimate critique to make against the company you work at?
It is. The problem is that's not everything that was in the memo, right? That was maybe the catalyst for the memo, but everything he wrote in the memo were the conclusions I just spent the beginning of my speech talking about, right? And those harmful conclusions and the emphasis he put on them, even the language that he used in the memo, right, that was really attacking in the memo itself, all of that matters, right? So just like you can say like, oh, how you do it does in fact matter, right? And so we still gave you several alternatives for that engagement that can still happen, none of which you've engaged with, and I guess you can't now. Let's go back to the material that was unengaged with for my first speaker, right? Less women joining tech. And by the way, we said Google is this status entity, right? You think Silicon Valley, you think Google, right? You think diversity, you think fighting for women's rights, you think Google, right? If this is the state of affairs at Google, do you imagine it's any better at Apple, at Amazon, and any of the other Silicon Valley giants, right? This means women as a whole are dissuaded from joining the tech industry. There's a couple of reasons why that's bad. One, it means there's less women in the tech industry to fight for the changes we're talking about, right? So to the extent that Sharma and Adil agree, we want to have more maternity leave, we want to have more sensitivity HR training to not make sexist comments, we want women to be able to fight for better negotiations so they have better pay, we want women to complaints about these things to be even taken seriously. The ability of women to fight for those is directly tied to the amount of women in the tech sector to begin with, right? To the extent that they don't want to enter or even go into those fields means that you don't get those changes on your side of the house. We think that's massively more important than any marginal benefit and engagement that you get. But secondly, we tell you that you lose the massively important ability of the creativity of these women. These women are talented engineers. They're talented software computer scientists, right? These are women who start the next businesses, the next Silicon Valley giants, and their creativity. And women do tend to have better communication abilities, correct? But that doesn't mean they're not technically competent. That together means that they often have the best ideas. They're able to communicate those ideas better to VCs, to investors, to government officials. That value is what we lose when women are dissuaded from entering the industry as a whole as a result of allowing this sort of communication, this sort of ideas to fester and remain. Google's PR and their brand, even from a self-interested perspective, had to be protected. Women in the workplace had to be protected. The future of women's rights had to be protected. That's why it was absolutely correct to fire James.
Thank you very much, Deputy Leader of Opposition. To start closing out the debate and invite members to come.
Someone's bell went off. I thought it was done. Yes. Opening opposition's case is extremely bizarre because it seems that just because of this memo, a lot of women are extremely disincentivized from joining the tech industry. That tech industries themselves have no incentive to change the kind of sexist behavior they have. But if you look at status quo and the current trends that are currently happening right now, multiple tech industries like Google, like Acer, are currently moving towards investing into campaigns that seek to include as many women as possible. The fact that Google invested $100 million in 2015 was to try to create cognitive dissonance or cognitive biases policies in challenging and confronting the kind of subtle biases that individuals have. That is to say, that memo cannot just be the complete disincentives for women to want to join the tech industry, when the tech industry are already making calculated steps and measures in trying to include them as much as possible. I'm going to do a few things in my speech. The first thing is I'm going to take opening up opposition out of this debate, and I'm going to talk about three other things. Number one, why exactly firing James Damore is a problem. Number two, what is the counterfactual if Sundar Pichai did not fire James Damore? But third but not least, and most importantly, is why is Google in the best position to moderate the discussion between the alternate right movement and the kind of Democrat voices within society? Let's look at the first thing then, right?
what exactly would he call of argumentation that came out of leader of opposition speech? He says that the principal ethics of Google and their work ethics means that they should disallow such discriminatory voices from existing. The first thing I want to say is that this principal consistency sounds very strange to me. The fact that Google still allows for searchers, for individual searchers by individuals to search for discriminatory articles on their Google platform means that Google in and of itself serves as a conduit that facilitates the kind of searches for discriminatory articles or even anti-feminist scientific journals that still exist through their platform. So if they really want to be principle consistent, it seems a bit strange that if you allow the wider majority to fight for these scientific journals or shoddy scientific journals to back their claims, that for some reason, if their own employee does it, is something that's unacceptable. But even if we were to engage to say that, oh, the employee has a greater burden or a duty or responsibility to not reflect these kind of instances, why exactly do these individuals still have a right in trying to voice out their opinion? Because I think it's important to recognize that all these shoddy scientific articles that they have, which is this whole opening debate about it's debatable, is that I really don't give a shit. It's about how do people perceive this kind of shoddy scientific articles and therefore use it to their own advantage. So this whole shoddy scientific article is strange. But secondly, right, this harms towards women in the tech industry. So as I just said, right, oftentimes these individuals, your most learned individuals, your university undergraduates, sometimes still believe in these shoddy scientific articles because it resonates with the kind of viewpoints they have. Just because you say that there's a bloc or opposite faction that says it's unimportant does not mean that they don't believe in these viewpoints anymore. So what exactly do we do in the comparative in trying to engage with these viewpoints? We might rather Google not fire James Damore and allow for a facilitation of greater discussion. I'm going to explain to you what that facilitation of discussion looks like. No, thank you. Number one, why exactly is firing James Damore a problem? And that's how we first uniquely extend from opening government. The first thing I like to say is that firing James Damore was extremely problematic because it granted ammunition to the alternate right movement. The fact that Milo Yiannopoulos wanted to conduct a video interview to get all of his viewpoints and claims was problematic, especially if you look at the position of power that James Damore was within the Google industry. The fact that he was a senior engineer in Google lost a lot of credibility to him as an individual. Him lending that voice to the alt-right movement was extremely disastrous, given the fact that the alt-right was able to say, the liberals are unwilling to engage with us once again. But what exactly is the impact given the fact of his credibility? Because they might say, but even if, we did fire him, he can still talk about he can still help Milo Yiannopoulos in his video interview. I think it's crucially different, because if we were willing to say that Google was willing to engage with his viewpoints rather than categorically reject him, the likelihood of him not wanting to air those views in comparative was much likely to be lesser versus the world of opposition. But secondly, what is the counterfactual is Sundar Pichai did not fire James Damore. So let's be clear, not firing him does not mean that Google agrees and legitimizes all the biological arguments that James Damore made. So I think Shermi was right in pointing that out. For example, Sundar Pichai will still be able to send out his very long-ass email that address all of his employees and say, these are biological arguments and viewpoints that we do not support. Secondly, right, is what happens if Google decides to keep him and what are the benefits? No, thank you. James Damore, airing his points of views and his viewpoints of how women engineers are, highlights the particular problem that pervades the tech industry. OG says that firing them worsens the problem as it now goes underground. We will provide the comparative. Google acceptance of James Damore means a few things. Number one, you allow a channel between Google and their employees who wants to share these viewpoints. Why exactly is that creation of a channel so particularly important? Because if we agree that firing this individual only sends those viewpoints underground, we think the comparative is if you don't fire him and say that those viewpoints to some degree should be discussed in an open discussion and dialogue, means that these individuals are willing to come to you and say that these are some of the viewpoints I have and these are some of the recommendations that I think we should consider. I think in all these instances and scenario, at least you allow for these viewpoints to come to the surface a lot easier rather than these individuals who silently keep them. Because I think the comparative is this. At the point in time when you make a very strong signaling and blatant firing of an individual, what happens is oftentimes these individuals, and it's very difficult to tell whether you are whether you are a conservative or a liberal when you join these kind of tech companies, right? Because it's very difficult to see the viewpoints of an individual through the kind of interviews and discussion. That is to say, we much rather under our side where individuals can at least be explicit in the kind of viewpoints that they have, because that explicitity means that at least we're able to have a better discussion within these areas. But yes, one of you, yeah.
could you please engage with, I gave several ways in which Google can engage with employees that are not so harmful to the morale of their female employees and the damage that they feel there. Can you tell me why those things are sufficient?
Yeah, so the whole, so as much as those platforms can exist, I do think this debate is also about why should Google not fire him, right? And that's the unique benefit, because Google is in the best position to moderate the discussion between the alt-right and the Democrat. Google being one of the largest players in the tech industry means that they have massive influence not only on the tech industry as a whole, but the kind of political discussion that happens. Oftentimes, they are seen to be a neutral reflection of diversity within their own positions. This is particularly important in status quo, given that there's a huge political divide between your Democrats and your alt-right, where both parties are unwilling to engage. If you're able to use Google as a channel and entry to have the moderated discussion that otherwise wouldn't have happened, because individuals always have an incentive to try to talk to Google, given the kind of strong corporate influence and economic influence that they have. We suggest that if you really want to try to moderate and have a better discussion, we think Google is in the best position to do so. You shouldn't have let this opportunity get away.
Thank you very much, member of government, to continue the exchange and live member propositions.
If the discussions you will have will result in less policies or no policies at all for women, we are happy to trade the discussions off. Fuck it, we'll skewer the truth if we can. So I'm going to talk about a few things, right, that comes from side government. But I'm going to start with CG, right? First, he told us how it will help the alt-right, right? Whatever he says will be used by Milo Yiannopoulos. Your neo-Nazis will be using these kind of things to validate their positions. But the thing is, whether you fire him or not, whether you fire James or not, when a person in such a position espouses and holds these views, the alt-right will still use it. The thing is, they become worse when they are validated by Google as a company. So, and he talks about how not firing is not a silent approval of what it is. I'll deal with that later in my substantives. But let's come to OG, right? So PM talked about how you have some true things in the memo, you have some good recommendations. Yeah, so even if it's true, even if some of the recommendations are good, it means that the narrative shifts from creating new policies to a narrative that says that, yeah, whatever thing you do, women are still inherently impeded by their female traits. We think that's harmful, right? Next, he talked about how, yeah, Google's male employees become more vitriolic. And he talks about how you are firing the wrong person because he's actually constructive versus you should fire closet sexists, right? But we think it's not unlikely because it's unlikely that these closet sexists will come out and espouse these views, right? And they become more vitriolic because they want to keep their jobs. Secondly, if that means, if them becoming more vitriolic means that the closet sexists that Adil talks about comes out of the closet and espouses these views in public, that means it's good. We will fire them too. Secondly, well, what does DPM talk about? She talks about how you can call out sexism instead of firing the dude. And then you will have open discussions versus, if you fire, then you shut down discussion, they go underground, and then you have microaggression and stuff like that. But we tell you that not firing means that not firing shows tolerance towards sexism in the workplace, and Google cannot afford that. Then she talks about how the free speech is the darling of the conservative media. But if it comes at the cost of women being attacked
who cares what the conservatives think? So the fair discourse that Shermaine wanted to talk about will happen in an 80% male environment, right? Making it less of a discourse and more of an echo chamber, right? Because all the more is led by a cis white male who is espousing these views versus firing him, and you force, at the worst case, you force all these views underground. They can't talk about it in Google, they can't talk about it in the workplace. You limit the propagation of such ideas. We protect women better. What do I want to talk to you about today? First, I want to talk about how you detract away from the issues that surrounds women in STEM fields. Secondly, I talk about how a show of why the show of Google's disapproval towards such views is so important, right? Firstly, why it detracts away from issues surrounding women in the STEM workforce. So even if it's true by journalistic standards, you cite a lot of things, it is by objective standards true. It's akin to the not all men, the hashtag not all men scenario, right? Yeah, so we agree that not all men are shit, right? We have some male allies towards the feminist movement. But saying that distracts away from the issues that women face, right? The aggression, harassment that are largely caused by the male population. So even if you say that's true that all men are shit, when you propagate the hashtag not all men thing, you make it worse, right? Because tell you that because when you allow ideas to be interrogated, either by naturally or by saturation, narrative become one focuses on the impediment itself. That means that whatever policies create, we might ever policies create to encourage more women in the workforce will be rooted in the belief that they are inherently because the narrative and workplace, the narrative and policy making becomes, are women actually discriminated against, or is it using structural, are we actually discriminated due to structural barriers, or is it something no one can really do anything about? We think that is highly harmful. Secondly, why a show of Google's disapproval of such views is so important. Yeah,
Right. So the thing is that there are many problems that women face, like for example, being like socialized into only doing like humanities work, for example, that sound uncomfortable, but are not settled questions in regards to why women face discrimination. Why are these not things that ought to be talked about, and why are they immediately discriminatory in the way in which it's being perceived?
Yeah, so yeah, when you allow such views, the discussion becomes one that talks about the structural barriers less, and talks about why removing structural barriers will be of no use because they are inherently impeded anyways. We think that is ultra harmful. That's super harmful. Secondly, why is the show of Google's disapproval of such views so important, right? We think because it came from James, right, who is a senior engineer in Google, and it was meant to defend Google, means that the failure to say anything, the failure to act on such views espoused is a silent approval from Google's board of directors. That means it harms women working in Google, right? Because you're working in a workplace that actively discredits your achievements in the work field due to your inherent traits. It harms women in general because when Google, frequently rated as one of the best employers on earth, doesn't believe in them, it means it harms the fight for more increased representation of women in STEM. But why firing helps progress, right? We think if Google, the leading data company, is disapproving of such a narrative, it means it will effectively discredit such narratives from being there in the first place. And then that means it's easier to push for women-friendly policies when the general public don't believe it. Right? So why is the show of force important? Besides discrediting such views, it's very important because it will empower women to put their faith in the company leadership. Zero tolerance means that women are taken seriously, means that the company leadership values them. That means when microaggressions that Shermaine wants to talk about, when the harassment that Shermaine wants to talk about that will happen in the workforce happens, it means that on our side, women are more likely to make a HR complaint because they actually believe in that they will be assisted by the company leadership. That means we create a safe space for women that will not be existent on government side. Never be prouder to oppose.
Thank you very much, Member of Opposition. To end the case of side government, we invite Government.
We think at the end of the day, everyone in this debate needs to recognize that stereotypes, that attitudes and beliefs of men within those companies still exist. The question then becomes, how do you A, reconcile and facilitate discussions, but B, ensure that the actual help you want to get to women actually gets to them, coming from a woman, right? I'm going to talk about a couple of things today. First of all, let's explain how we already take it over OO. Then I'm going to do a CO, and lastly explain why Farhan is the most important person in this debate, something he likes to hear a lot. First of all, how do we take it over OO, right? Because if you listen to them, a couple of things they wanted to argue. First, Google must be principally inconsistent. Second, the outcome and impact of that is to encourage women to join technology, like the tech industry, to facilitate change. This was why they wanted to fire James in the first place. But if that's the case, right, the important question coming up uniquely from CJ is, are you then willing to fire every man in the company who A, agreed with, but B, actually believed in James' memo? If they say yes, sure, then all the harms that Sharmi want to talk about already stands. I give it to them, right? But more importantly, we think it's unlikely that they can say yes, given you can't just fire every individual within that company, right? In that case, all the harms they wanted to talk about still exist. There was no mechanistic analysis about how they can change these opinions anyway. They wanted to send strong messages. So what? You think your strong messages work? Is it? We don't think so. But more importantly, the kind of toxic environment they wanted to remove still exists. Remember that many men actually agreed with and believed James at that point of publishing that memo. Therefore, the harms of less women joining tech, less ideas, and less policies are still going to exist on their side. The failure of OO is their inability to change and solve the root problem they set out to solve. In that case, here's the thing. They cannot say that they want to remain principally consistent and fire them, yet in that same manner be hypocritical in not firing all men. That's why Farhan was so important. He gave you the solution and strategic positioning of Google that will best achieve their outcome of encouraging women to join the tech industry and all the benefits they want to talk about in the first place. How so? Things like, for example, A, don't let James become the face of the outright movement. B, facilitate discussion, for example, calling him out, for example, facilitating and bridging the different perspectives. Their alternative was forums. Like, look, it doesn't work. At the point in which you fire James, right, you shut down all discussion. There's no incentive for the outright to then engage with you in any kind of discussion that you wanted to have on your side. But B, it really doesn't matter. It's a retrospective value judgment debate, right? That's why we think OO is already out of the debate. Then CEO came out and tell us on the same issue that they wanted to fire all closet like sexists. Okay, then all the harms Farhan talked about is still going to be further worsened. Things like how you're going to further legitimize the outright movement. Things like how you're going to have further ammunition for the outright movement. Things like how there's further polarization and less bridging of perspective. All the harms Farhan talks about are only going to be worsened by their policy of going to fire every single closet sexist. The only way to resolve and reconcile is for Google to moderate and facilitate discussions. In that case, like, yeah, I think we already take it over OO. Let's do a CO, right? Because if you listen to them, no, thank you. No. The first thing CEO wanted to talk about was affirmative action policies to help women, like, because they believe that perhaps they are biologically incapable, perhaps that's to some extent true, and therefore you want to help these women through affirmative policy. Like, so what? Even if it's true or false that they are perhaps biologically less capable or more capable, right? The true impact and the true important part is that people still believe in them. At the point in which people still believe in them, all the attitudes, all the behaviors, all the harms they want to talk about still exist. The question is, how do you change these attitudes? Changing these attitudes doesn't mean necessarily fire every individual that somehow comes up and like open up about those views. We think the only way to change these views is to engage individuals in conversation, convince them and talk to them about why their views are not necessarily correct, and that's how you change perspective. We think affirmative action policies to allow for such women to proliferate doesn't solve the root problem of systemic discrimination, systemic stereotypes, and attitudes against women. Then they want to talk about how Google staying silent was harmful. No, thank you. Look, we told you right from Farhan's speech, right, that Google doesn't have to stay silent. Farhan said that he can still, like, for example, call out, send out an email to explain why that wasn't the company's stance. We don't think that's in contradiction with not firing James. The important part is this. At the point where you fire James, A, you don't allow anyone to convince or engage with James other than the outright movement who wanted to interview him in the first place, therefore allowing him to become the face of the outright movement. At the point in which you fire James, you no longer have the ability to then convince him to your side. We think that's a unique harm coming out from their side. Go.
To the extent that you won't allow hate speech in Google, right? We think you also want to have some sort of balance between free speech and engagement and protecting people in the workplace, right? Tell me why our model of firing James but allowing all the other avenues of engagement that I talked about to still protect women, why that's not a good enough balance.
Because you assume that your alternatives are going to work. We tell you that engagement can only exist at the point in which people are willing to engage. People willing to engage, meaning both the people who are women and being discriminated against, and the people who hold these views in the first place. If these individuals feel like, somehow if I voice my views, I can perhaps get fired, I don't think these individuals are going to engage in your forums anyway. Anonymity. Anonymity is an avenue for abuse. People could potentially be even more violent and belligerent in what they say. But B, anonymity also means it's very difficult to tell who are the individuals who hold those views and therefore change those views for these individuals. Your alternatives are actually insufficient. The last thing Emma wanted to talk about was safe space for women. Safe space for women, right, isn't just firing every individual in that sphere. We think safe space for women means a few things. A, ensuring that they're able to engage their counterparts in discussion, but B, ensuring that the fundamental stereotypes are changed. The true way to provide safe space is to ensure that women's systemic discrimination is reversed. We think that's the only way to provide a safe space that they wanted. Why then is Google the most important and the only platform, and why is Farhan so important? Recognize that these views and perspectives are going to happen anyway. The point of this debate is to ask, how do we actually change those views? In that sense, in a world where views are largely polarized, you need a neutral body to reconciliate and facilitate discussions. Google is in the best position because it's diverse, because it's large in company, and because it stands on neutrality. This means if you want any possibility of solving the problem of this debate, you need to ensure that Google is co-opted in this entire movement. That's why Farhan was so important, right? Because he's the only one that gives you actual analysis about how we overcome and solve that fundamental problem. For example, allowing for greater moderation of the viewpoints from both sides rather than allowing either sides to be extremists in their views. For example, Google can drag both together because it's sheer size and scale in operations. This means if individuals on both sides are unwilling to engage, Google is in the best position to pull both individuals to come together to consensus and come together for a discussion. Google is the only entity, and that's important because that's the only way to solve the root problem of today's debate. For these reasons, I'm extremely proud to stand in closing government.
All right, thank you very much, Gov. Let's end this debate. We invite Off-Wit.
What?
The memo written by James Damore was actually quite well written. It followed some kind of journalistic standards, it cited things, it used logic and reason to try achieve a conclusion. And there are some credible things, there are some pretty decent recommendations, some true stuff. But the key thing to remember about the memo is that in the larger discourse about women in society, it says women aren't as discriminated as we think. Women don't need as much help as we think they do. And the key problem with this narrative, Mr. Speaker, is that if we accept women go through a lot of problems in society in terms of access to opportunity and oppression, and we don't have proportionate measures in terms of policies to cater to those problems, any attempt to limit our narrative as to whether or not we need to help women is harmful to women in general. And that's the unique thing coming from closing opposition, right? Because what did we tell you in our arguments, which wasn't engaged with, it was engaged here, I didn't understand the response from closing government, right? We told you that it detracts from very good discourse for women. Because the discussion, James Damore goes to the extent of saying that there are genetic reasons why women also can't participate in the STEM field altogether, right? So what that discussion often creates is the narrative that are women actually even discriminated to begin with, or is it really other factors that we can't really fix, and therefore policies shouldn't be as much catered to women as possible. And that's why we drew the parallel to like the hashtag of not all men, right? Though it being true that not all men are bad people, at the point in which you include yourself in the narrative, the discussion becomes, what are the kinds of men who are like this? And less about the problems that women face specifically and the policies that women need specifically, right? So if we accept that women aren't granted as many opportunities as possible and policies aren't as good right now, then you don't want policies to be proportionate in response to James Damore's memo, but disproportionately more so that we can grant more access to women into the STEM fields as opposed to just doing a sufficient job, right? It's because we don't think women are being treated fairly right now in society. We also told you that we are more likely to allow women to access human resource by making complaints if they feel that they are in a safer environment, right? At the point which sexist or bigoted things are being said, no thank you, they are more likely to approach HR if they feel that Google will challenge any attempt to discredit their existence in the company by saying that James Damore's memo is bad, right? So we think this is great. Not really engaged with. Maybe you did, but I don't know what he said. Closing argument. So they said this will create space for the alt-right and liberals to discuss the kind of things, right? So if Google endorses views, they can at least have that discussion. And this discussion is very important because political polarization is a true problem in society, right? But we don't like what this discourse looks like, right? Because it also means it's less policies for women altogether. But B, we would say that space to discuss everything else, i.e. like whether or not economically we need to be free market, will still be open to these alt-right individuals. Just because we suppress a memo on gender and diversity by the Google diversity team, that doesn't mean Google's other teams will suppress the kind of important discussion Google needs to have in terms of economic policies or things that the alt-right members care about, right? But lastly, the reason why we don't like the kind of discourse that happens is that we have to understand Google's employee population is 80% male, and this discussion is led by a white cis male member of society. What is that discussion going to look like, Mr. Speaker? It's going to be an echo chamber that's going to be really, really bad for women who are in the company to begin with, right? So a bunch of people on their computers emailing each other about the fact that women are pretty shit, guys, they don't really deserve to be here, we are all superior than them. It's just going to be such a toxic environment for women. We are not going to let that discussion happen, and we are happy to skewer the truth if that requires happening. Yes.
Yeah, so it seems like the entirety of your case presumes that men will always believe in what they already do and never change those opinions. But in a world in which they are never able to canvass those opinions or to hear anything opposes their side and are simply chilled from even speaking out in the first place, how then do you do the microaggressions and make the tech industry so hostile to women in the first place?
Yeah. So the comparative here is, I agree that in these echo chambers and underground, it's going to still be sort of an echo chamber as well, right? But if the comparative is two echo chambers, then we will minimize the harm that women face in particular in the office space if we can't guarantee that men will change their viewpoints altogether. So people will continue to believe in these opinions, and this is why I'll deal with opening government in particular. So if people continue to believe in these opinions, do we fire them or engage them in that discourse? Now, obviously, I told you why if we engage them in that discourse, it'll be sort of toxic and it's unhappy, and we are happy to trade that off. But also, more importantly, we also limit its capacity to spread, right? Because here's the key difference between the discussion being upstairs and downstairs, right? When the discussion is upstairs, your James Damore and every other Google employee has access to Google servers that can send immediate emails and memos to 10,000 people across at the same time and tell them that women are genetically inferior. And downstairs, they can't do the same thing. So that means if they're going to have a discussion at home with like 3 circle of friends in the mama shop outside Google, this discussion isn't as great, it's toxic, but it's not as propagatory as it would be upstairs, right? So we don't like the discussion being upstairs. If we can limit the capacity of that ideas to spread, we are happy to limit the capacity. And also in addition to that, we'll say Google has a diversity team, right? They can always re-engineer the narrative that it is upstairs, the way in which they hire people. They will hire people who are more likely to support women-friendly policies. They will fire people who openly discredit women. These are all ways in which the Google diversity team can always re-engineer the narrative. we think that only the open discussion that happens upstairs, I don't know why I'm living upstairs, downstairs, it just makes sense to me. The discussion that happens upstairs is the only one that's effective in creating the changes in policies for women, right? Because your underground discussion is just going to remain an underground discussion, but policy making is based on what happens upstairs. And we think when your Google diversity team, your Google CEO, and your Google members of employee who aren't easily as propagated as they are, or like led to believe that women are genetically inferior as they are on your side, we think that these same individuals are more likely to lobby for things like better, higher affirmative action policies for women because they aren't impeded by the idea that women are genetically inferior anymore, right? I think that that's a far better world to live in because there's less space to propagate altogether. Now, just the last thing I'm going to deal with is how companies send the message that it's not a safe space for conservative altogether. We would say, okay, if it is truly harmful that for a conservative to say the things that they want to say in that particular space, we are okay with them not saying those things. Because if those things come at the cost of women feeling safe in those environments and detracts from the discourse even more, we're happy to trade that off. We would prefer a world where we have more policies and better policies for women that aren't impeded by genetic inferiorities.
Thank you very much. Off with discourse launch, shake hands, and proceed back to LT1. This includes all members of the audience.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was really ready to funny. Thank you.
Why are you laughing already? Because no, it's not. You might want to switch.
I really don't know. How is dating like? How is dating? You.